Hi, this is Carin, Zissis of ASCOA Online. The Dominican Republic's Luis Abinader is one of the world's most popular leaders. So it may come as little surprise that he appears to be on comfortable footing to win in the first round of the country's presidential vote on May 19th. His government has earned praise for anti-corruption efforts, economic growth, and a strong COVID vaccination campaign. When Abinader won in 2020, he pledged change, particularly when it came to battling graft. Now, as he seeks a second term, the president and his modern revolutionary party, the PRM, are asking Dominicans for continuity.
Son cuatro más, el cambio sigue. Luis 24, el pueblo lo pide. Son cuatro más, el cambio sigue. Luis 24.
But it's worth noting that the country's political climate differs from the rest of Latin America. Presidents tend to be popular. Dominican presidential elections don't go to runoffs. Polarization levels are low. And that's not all.
Unlike other countries in the region, the Dominican Republic has kept the party system. It has changed somewhat due to divisions, fragmentations of the main parties, but the party system has not collapsed.
That's Dr. Rosario Espinal, Professor Emeritus of Temple University, sociologist, and a longtime political analyst from the Dominican Republic. She joined me in a conversation offering larger context to understand this year's elections. She covered what we learned from February's municipal votes, concerns about voter turnout, and what ties with Haiti mean for the vote. In a year of elections all around the globe, this is the fourth in our special election series. Past episodes covered the economic agenda for Panama's next president, the youth vote in Mexico, and Nayib Bukele's global reach. Visit as-coa.org/podcast to catch up on past editions. We also want to share that we'll be hosting President Abinader at our upcoming Washington Conference on the Americas on May 8th. Go to www.as-coa.org/WCA2024 for more about the event. Thank you to our listeners all around the world, from Denver to Belo Horizonte to Stockholm. Sign up for Latin America in Focus on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss an episode.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Thank you so much for being with us today. We're really excited to have you. I wanted to start off by setting the stage for our listeners. Now, President Luis Abinader has high approval levels, the second highest in Latin America after Nayib Bukele, and he polls well ahead of his rivals. His party, the PRM, won big in the recent municipal elections, and he won himself in the first round of the presidential elections for his first term. Do you think there's going to be a second round in this election? Is there going to be a runoff?
Very unlikely. The second round was introduced to the Constitution of the Dominican Republic in 1994, and only in 1996 there was a second round. After that, there hasn't been a second round ever.
Oh, wow. So we're going to get into this in this discussion. There are a lot of things that make the Dominican Republic different from a lot of other countries in Latin America. But one issue I'd like to get your view on is voter turnout, because in the municipal elections in February, there was a very high abstention rate in a lot of the votes. If you just take the mayor's race in Santo Domingo, incumbent Carolina Garcia won easily with over 60% of the vote, but the abstention rate was 74%. In the 2020 presidential vote, we also saw relatively low voter turnout. That was during the pandemic, but I wanted to get your view on abstention. Is there concern about a high abstention rate in the May 19th election?
Historically, at least starting in 1978, when there was the transition really to democratic politics, the Dominican Republic has had low abstention rate. So many Dominicans go and vote. The difference was in 2020 when at the presidential level, historically, the average from 1978 to 2016, the average was 28% abstention. In 2020, for the presidential level, it was close to 45% abstention. Many people attributed that to the pandemic. And ever since I've said we have to wait to 2024 presidential elections to really know if there is something else going on in addition to the issue of the pandemic in 2020. So very soon we will find out.
I saw an interview you gave where you talked about one way that the Dominican Republic differs from a lot of its Latin American peers is that the political parties have collapsed in a lot of the region this century. In many countries, voters don't really identify with particular parties anymore. But that's not the case in the Dominican Republic, where the PLD governed for about 16 years from 2004 to 2020. And now the PRM seems poised to become a strong party. Why is the Dominican Republic different in this regard?
Well, to put this in context, Dominican presidents tend to get high levels of approval. It is not just Abinader. If you look at previous presidents, unless there is an economic crisis like in 2003, 2004, there was a financial crisis that brought about inflation and devaluation of the Dominican peso, then you see a drop in presidential approval rate. Other than that, presidents tend to have high levels of approval. Since the 1990s, we could safely say, especially since the mid 1990s, that the Dominican Republic, with the exception of the financial crisis in 2003-04, has had economic stability and it has had political stability. The two things go hand in hand quite frequently, but it is important to point that out because that is not common in the region. The other point that needs to be indicated to understand the context is that, unlike other countries in the region, the Dominican Republic has kept the party system. It has changed somewhat due to divisions, fragmentations of the main parties, but the party system has not collapsed as it has happened in other countries in the region. So, in a way, the same factors that allowed the Dominican Liberation Party to rule for 16 years, namely economic stability, unity while in government, and division of the opposition, those same factors are helping now the current government that came to power in 2020 to show electoral strength.
And we did see a sign of that in the municipal elections, right? In the sense that the PRM did very well in those February municipal elections. Has the Dominican Republic managed to avoid some of that polarization that we're seeing in other parts of the region?
Not that much polarization. The party in power tends to attract most people because one has also to say that this is a very clientelistic state. And, clientelistic politics is very important. So, all the little parties, lots of people sort of go after, whoever is in power, because whoever is in power is going to deliver goodies. And so lots of people move that way, which is part of the reason why there is this low level of competitiveness. And so you don't really have that, huge polarization that you see in other countries. And part of the reason is because of the power of the state. Whoever happens to make it to rule, if they don't face a major economic crisis or don't split up, they're likely to stay in power for a while.
It's interesting to me with some of the background you've given us that Abinader's campaign uses this slogan, "El cambio sigue," or "the change continues," which is kind of the change continues. So you, it's sort of a paradox of an idea. But at a certain point, it's hard to frame it as change if it's continuing. What's the change that he's presenting now? And especially if this is a party that we're seeing is rising as this dominant party.
Well, the idea of the change came up in the 2020 elections. And the change referred to the argument that the PLD, while in power for 16 years, had promoted corruption and impunity. And that, they controlled the judicial system and there were no consequences for these corrupt actions. That was the theme of the 2020 elections. So the PRM presented itself as the party that was going to fight corruption. So that was the big promise, the big change. So now the idea of the change continues is linked to this idea that looking back is basically going back to corruption, and that they are the ones who promise to keep making improvements in the judicial system or the administration on the side of the executive to fight corruption. So that is the theme really around which the 2020 elections evolved, and that the PRM is trying to replicate now.
Mm-hmm. Now, you pointed to some of these things that Abinader and his government has sort of gotten praise around, this idea of improving anti-corruption moves, the judicial system. Another thing that they've talked about a lot and trumpeted is success around fighting COVID-19 and a successful pandemic strategy. As you referred to, he's done well in part because the economy's done well, just as prior presidents did. So there's been strong economic growth. I'm curious, what are the issues that are worrying voters then as they head to the voting booth?
Yeah, the number one issue, according to the polls, is basically inflation. No question, inflation is the problem, the main problem that the government faces. However, that inflation is not generating a major problem electorally for the government, because it is offset by the fact that sort of especially the middle class, which is the strong sort of base of support for the current government, has decided to give the benefit of whatever doubt to the government, given the previous government 16 years in power and the corruption cases. And so give them the benefit of the doubt if you want, or as a sign of approval, whatever way you want to put it. But that's sort of the attitude. And that may be a reason for abstention. We have to wait until the elections. But in a way, sort of the other side of the population is like unmotivated, because the opposition is divided. And because they divided, and they out of power, they don't have too much to kind of motivate their own electorate. Even if they don't support the government, they don't have the ability to motivate their own electorate to vote for them even. So this is not an election of great interest or euphoria. That's not what you sense, because there is not much polarization, because it's basically a segment of society deciding that they're going to sort of vote again for the party they voted for in 2020 to bring about the change. And then there is another segment of the electorate, like wait and see. They're not particularly happy, but they don't have a strong incentive to vote for the opposition because they split.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you a question about the current government and the Dominican Republic's place in the world. So we have a few issues that are important issues in the Dominican Republic, and most notably, perhaps the biggest one is Haiti, which has been going through a kind of political crisis. I'm curious, what is the mood on the ground about Dominican-Haitian relations? And what is the view of how the current government has handled those relations?
Yeah, the current government figured out back in late 2021 that it could benefit a lot from the theme of Haiti. The situation in Haiti was deteriorating, and basically, the government incorporated the rhetoric and sort of the measures of the ultra right. So basically, the president and and the main figures in the government have been basically saying the Dominican Republic is not responsible for solving Haitians' problem. It cannot be put on the Dominican Republic. The solution of the Haitian problems, the international community has to intervene in Haiti. So there has been a persistent rhetoric of the government. In addition, they have increased the apprehension of Haitians in the Dominican Republic that supposedly they are deporting. It is unclear, however, how much corruption there is in the process uh, in terms of letting them back in or never getting them to Haiti, but basically apprehensions and and having people in detention centers. Oh, in addition, building the fence, as they call it, on the border. I mean, all those things, the government has adopted those ideas and practices, and the population supports them. That is part of the explanation for Abinader's approval rating, too. It's not only the corruption, which was the 2020 theme. They knew they needed another theme for the 2024 elections. Not because corruption was gone, but because by itself it wouldn't have the power it had in 2020. So they found this ultra nationalistic sort of discourse, which has been very profitable in terms of gathering the support of the people, because that is a theme where most Dominicans are basically in agreement about Haiti being a threat to the Dominican Republic and taking all the measures necessary to deal with this. Now, there is a contradiction in all this because, on the one hand, they can say and do all that. But on the other hand, there is an economic reality. Haitians come to the Dominican Republic because they are allowed to come, paying a fee or whatever means to the authorities, but primarily because they are employed heavily in agriculture and construction above all, and they remain undocumented. So if you were to move all Haitians back to Haiti tomorrow, there would not be labor in the Dominican Republic. So, in a way, there is a contradiction in terms between the economic needs of cheap labor on one hand and nationalism on the other. So, this is a tension, and the issue is really more. I mean, the issue becomes more or less important depending on when a government wants to make it important. But the reality is that there is a contradiction in terms between these nationalistic postures and this economic reality of the demand in agriculture and construction for cheap labor force that only is provided by Haitians.
It's interesting because it's hard not to think that there's some parallels here with another country that where a lot of people also are building a wall, and on the one hand trying to deport immigrants, but at the same time needing immigrants for labor. It makes me think of another country.
Yeah, I mean, the United States has the same dilemma, and so other countries that face that, where you do have a big demand for cheap labor, but at the same time, you want to demonize the people who provide that cheap labor. If you look at the United States, the discourse against Latinos, for instance, Latinos provide a good deal of the labor force in agriculture and construction for the US. At the same time, they label as criminals and blah, blah, blah. So it's the same dilemma of nationalism versus the need for cheap labor to exploit in major segments of the economy.
Hmm. I do want to also, we just drew this comparison, and I want to ask one final question. How do Dominicans feel about U.S. Dominican relations, and how important has that been to the Abinader government?
Well, in a way, you have there another contradiction, which is on the one hand, there is a large Dominican migration to the United States. I mean, the Dominican Republic depends heavily on the United States. For instance, tourism. Most tourists come from the United States. Remittances. Most remittances come from the United States. Export processing zones. All production goes to the United States. On the other hand, um, Dominicans want their sovereignty, their independence. They don't want the U.S. saying anything about Haiti or, accepting migrants or refugees or anything that would sound like putting pressure on the DR. But there is this tension. On the one hand, high dependency on the U.S. On the other hand, the search for sovereignty, and don't tell us what to do.
Doctora, it was wonderful to have you on the podcast with us today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Carin Zissis. This episode was produced by John Orbach. Special thanks to Maria Desperadel for her reporting contributions to this episode. Throughout the year, get content on Latin America's elections through our guide at as-coa.org/2024. And check the podcast notes for a link to our poll tracker for the Dominican Republic and an America's Quarterly profile of President Abinader. And get information about our 2024 Washington Conference on the Americas, where we'll be recognizing President Abinader with the Chairman's Award for Leadership in the Americas. The music in this podcast is Pacholi, performed by Pedro Martinez for America Society. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. You can access other episodes of Latin American Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast and send us feedback at latinfocus@as-coa.org. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.